On Saturday morning, tomorrow morning, bright and early, 8:30, 9 o'clock, we're going to have a new session, Critique Your Work. So myself and some of my other colleagues on the RTDNA, if we've solicited this from students. If you have audio, if you have video, if you have print copies of your work, they're going to run it by us, and we're going to give you some constructive criticism. So and that goes for anyone, young reporters or anchors. So I think that'll be kind of fun. Paul Cross is our first student who will be coming to us. Great. And I just wanted to reiterate, too, something that Fiona said at 5 o'clock. It really is a must attend with Lara Zatrakian about changing newsroom culture. Given the Me Too movement, I think what Lara has to say, what she's experienced, where she's coming from is quite important for especially young people coming into newsrooms. Newsrooms today are a lot different than they were 30 years ago, let me tell you. So I think it's going to be a great session. Okay, let's get underway with this one. I will introduce our panel, and then the topic, obviously, is podcasts. New content models. Podcasts make money. They do. And we're here to tell you how they make money and how you can have great podcasts. So let me start with Leslie Merklinger. She's a Senior Director, Content Development with CBC. Leslie? Hello. Jeff Ulster, Chief Content and Technology Officer, The Podcast Exchange.
Hello.
And Chris Duncombe, he's a Director of Streaming and Podcasting for Corus Entertainment. And our moderator today is Lindsay Michael, co-host and producer, CBC Podcast Playlist.
Hello.
Take it away, Lindsay.
All right. So I think maybe we'll just start by getting an overview of what you each do. So the theme of today's talk is new content models in podcasting, how they make money. And so maybe I'll start, Chris, by getting you to talk a bit about your role.
Sure. My role is actually about a month old. I've been Director of Digital for Corus Entertainment for a while, about 6 years. And probably about 2 years ago, we had started really formalizing our podcast strategy and built out a network and started taking a good hard look at what programming we had and what made a lot of sense and how we might think about original programming and those things. So I've taken over now, just moving directly into podcasting and streaming, and am in the middle of creating a bunch of brand new brands for us in addition to leveraging our television and radio content. And then taking a good look at what content we can be building out of our existing brands, not only in radio, but in our specialty television networks, and really building on the strength of Corus's digital presence and how we might be fully integrated in that regard. So it's an exciting new world, and I'm glad to be solely focused on this now.
That's great. Leslie, what is your role at the CBC?
I came from television, actually. So when I came to CBC, there was an opportunity to really reach out to younger, more diverse audiences through the creation of original podcasts. We had been podcasting radio shows at CBC for a while, but this was a real opportunity to create digital-first content, and really in the environment where Serial and Planet Money and Radiolab were exploding, CBC was really looking to get in that space. And so I oversee the development of all the new podcasts. 3 years I've been there, and we've got 13 series and another 4 coming in the fall. So it's busy.
Jeff?
I'm a former CBCer. So I worked there for many years as a producer, and then the last position I had there was as Director of Digital Talk Content. So I was more overseeing the distribution and the product around CBC's digital talk audio. I left there about a year and a half ago now, and started my own consulting company. Wound up doing production and podcasts and consulting, and I was involved in a big research report, which I can talk a little bit about later, around Canadian podcast listening. And out of that research, myself and a co-founder of a company, we both realized there was an opportunity. In Canada, it seemed there was a lot of great podcasts. There were a lot of listeners out there, but it was really hard for people to make money, and it was hard to monetize the Canadian audience for a bunch of reasons. So we sort of saw a gap and figured if we could find a way to sort of connect up Canadian advertisers and agencies, with publishers who are reaching Canadian listeners, that there might be an opportunity to sort of help 3 sets of people, to help those Canadian listeners who are listening to American ads mostly that aren't relevant to them, to help Canadian agencies who are trying to reach podcast audiences, and to try to help podcast publishers monetize the Canadian audience. And so that's what the Podcast Exchange does.
Jeff, since you mentioned your research, I think that's actually a really good place to start, to sort of give us an overview of what the podcasting landscape is.
Yeah, so I'm looking at my iPhone because I'm going to rhyme off a few numbers for you just to give you some context. In the world of podcasting, it started out very, very much an Apple derivative. So everybody could find podcasts in Apple's iTunes store. Apple was pretty good about being supportive around podcasting, but over the years it's gone to more and more platforms. But Apple still kind of dominates in the landscape, so maybe 50 to 70% of podcasts that people are listening to, they're getting at through the Apple Podcast service. So just to give you some context around that, there's more than 525,000 active shows in the Apple Podcast Store. So those are titles, podcast titles. In terms of individual episodes, there are more than 18.5 million episodes available on Apple Podcasts alone, spanning 100 languages and 155 different countries. They say they've had more than 50 billion all-time downloads and streams in Apple Podcasts alone. So that just gives you a sense of the scope, and then you can add to that number because that's just Apple. And within Canada specifically, I co-published a study with Audience Insights, which is a research company, and we did it for the Globe initially, but we did a survey of 2,500 Canadians initially, and then we sort of zeroed in on monthly podcast listeners. And what we found was 43%, or 12.5 million Canadians have ever listened to a podcast. 10 million of those have listened within the last year. We were really looking at monthly podcast listeners. We think that's a person who's regularly listening. More than 7 million monthly podcast listeners in Canada, so that's about 24% of the population. This study was done last summer, so you can add, I'm sure, 3 or 4% to that. 15% of Canadians listen weekly, 4% are listening every day. The audience generally, although it's a mixed audience, it skews on the male side, it skews on the 18 to 34 side a little bit. They tend to be more affluent and more educated than your average media consumer, or your average Canadian, I should say. They spend about 4 hours a week listening, and if you're in those other demographics, you're going to listen more. There's about 27% of those monthly listeners actually are listening 5 hours or more a week, and those numbers are going up all the time. And the only other thing I'll flag out of that study, and there's a ton of stuff in the study which I encourage you to look at, is we did find there's an appetite for Canadian podcasts. So Canadians want to hear more about Canadian podcasts. Yeah, it's good news.
Which is great
being
for all
Canadians.
of us.
Yeah.
I think it's speaking to that, creating podcasts here in Canada for a Canadian audience and maybe beyond Canada. It's challenging to figure out kind of how to get into that market and how to stand out. Leslie, you recently created sort of a strategy to figure out what CBC's way into that will be. Mm-hmm. How did you go about creating that strategy for podcasting at CBC?
In a few ways. I think, first of all, we looked at the audience that we weren't getting on CBC Radio. CBC Radio, it's a beloved brand. It's an incredibly powerful brand. The content is fantastic. But, like a lot of terrestrial and traditional media platforms, the audience was getting older and didn't necessarily reflect the diversity of this country. And so for us, it's all about relevance. It's all about it, especially as the public broadcaster. I mean, it's really incumbent on us to reflect and engage the nation. And so how do you do that if you are only reaching a certain part of that nation through radio? So you've got to find other ways, and it's digital. And we all know that younger, more diverse audiences are experiencing and seeking media out on digital. And so podcasting was a huge opportunity for us to expand our audience and to be more relevant. And the other way so there was that. We looked at the gaps of content that were on CBC Radio 1. What are we not covering? What are we not speaking to? Who are we not speaking to? And what kinds of content do we not have room for on the schedule or have sort of achieved some sort of different perspectives? So that was an opportunity to kind of look at the gaps and see where podcasting might fill in some of those gaps. And then also, it was really about looking at the genres and looking at what was doing well in the podcast space. So that immersing ourselves in what was popular and what people were responding to in podcasts, that was the other piece of the puzzle that we brought into our beginnings in this space. And we started out with 2 podcasts we started 3 years ago to do original podcasts, and we started with a show called Campus, which was set on university campuses and personal storytelling. We did another show called Backstory, which was very, very simple show, but it was reporters talking about, from a very personal perspective, what covering a particular news story was like. And that was a real change for those reporters who, I was telling them, say the word I all the time in this podcast, and they weren't used to that, and they're trained to not say I. So that was the beginning, and then I think our real success was led. We obviously looked at genres that are popular, and obviously crime is hugely popular and investigative, and so Someone Knows Something became a mega hit for us. Really, it not only topped the charts and stayed at the top of the charts in Canada, but it hit #1 in the U.S. on iTunes, and around the world it's done very well. And I think, insanely, it's up to 65 million downloads. We're just about to launch season 5, but seasons 1 to 4 we're at that number, which is kind of crazy.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and so that also opened doors for us to do lots of other things. So we now have 13 series and more coming across lots of different genres. So that was kind of our way in to look at what we were lacking, what our goals were as a public broadcaster, and then what the space offered in terms of content and where we could be. I lost a lot of sleep when we were launching SKS, because in the specter of serial, you don't want to be considered a poor cousin,
right?
But you want to be in that space that's popular. So that really got us there.
Just a quick question before we move on to Chris is now when there's so much competition out there, what are the things you look at when deciding what kind of series to follow?
Yeah, I mean, I was up to 500,000 podcasts. You're telling me it's now 525,000 podcasts, and the episode number is just stressing me out because it's competitive. But just a little context too. I come from a highly competitive private industry, and CBC Radio, I think, was not used to being in competition. It was the only game in town in terms of really smart, amazing, in-depth talk radio, that volume of it. Other broadcasters, of course, have done some, but so I was used to competition, and that's fine, and that actually really excites me. But look at what we could do that was original, that was maybe in the space that's popular, but what we could bring to that was unique. And also, I'm working with some of the best audio producers and hosts in North America, and we're also working with external people as well and producers from outside the CBC, but to start with the CBC audio talent is an amazing toolkit that I had right off the bat. So that was part of the opportunity that we saw.
I was just going to ask, going off program for 1 sec, but because Leslie mentioned serial, how many of you listen to podcasts out there? Wow. So you guys you're all in already. Okay, thanks. I was just curious.
That's a pretty good number.
To a podcast session.
Yes, but sometimes people, believe me, people come without even knowing what it is. Yeah, no, it's very common. You want to learn about it.
So Chris, you're in a really exciting position. Mm-hmm. You are going to be setting the course now for Corus, moving forward with podcasting and streaming. What are you thinking about as you're deciding what direction to take your organization in terms of podcasting?
Yeah, I think the first questions we ask ourselves are, what can we really do well? Mm-hmm. I know that there are a few things on our list that we probably won't endeavor to do, and large Hollywood-style fictional series are not going to be a strength for us. I think that one of the biggest opportunities that's presented in the podcast space comes out of the dawn of the daily and the shorter form contextual style news program, whether it's Today Explained or Up First. ABC starts here, and there's a million others coming up as you go. The ability to be able to think about how to take our news stations. We have news talk stations in all the markets, and so 7 very big heritage brands. How we take advantage of the programming that comes out of there. At the same time, how do you take advantage of that younger and more elusive audience that's on the go, that is got a diehard interest in news content and investigative? I mean, true crime wouldn't do as well as it's been doing if there weren't an appetite for that. So I think there are opportunities for us to think about what we can do really well and build original podcasts out of that. I think if you take a look at even a podcast that launched this week, Market Snacks, which is a cooperation between a newsletter and Cadence 13, which is a very trusted platform. Not only has that show launched and had a ton of press around it, but it's sponsored and has never had one download. So I think you're starting to see platforms build trust with audience and advertisers, and I think there's huge opportunities there. That podcast is literally a business and tech podcast, 15 minutes long, comes out every day, and is focused on millennials. There's a huge opportunity to be able to gather an audience that's not that is challenged to listen to AM radio in its traditional sense, and less so in the streaming sense. Beyond that, we're really interested in being the most integrated network we can possibly be, so that opportunities across 39 radio stations and 45 specialty TV channels and global news and the success of globalnews.ca gives us opportunities to build audience in different ways and introduce a brand new audience to programming. So will we play in the investigative space? Absolutely, because that's a strength for us. We're building new programs out of shows that existed before that we've reimagined, and I'll give you an example. Alan Cross, who is very near and dear to all of our hearts in Canada as a broadcaster, we own hundreds of episodes of the ongoing history of new music. But we reimagined that show as a podcast without all the songs in it that it would play as a radio show. And that's become very successful. It's consistently been #1 in the music podcast charts and is only really just getting started. There are a bunch of new programs we already have in development that will launch over the next little while, and I'm really excited about that in terms of how we reimagine it. But the opportunities for news specifically and how it's reimagined in the podcast space, I think, are endless. And it's not going to be the typical podcast you hear now in the podcast space. I think you're going to hear brand new, shorter, more mobile-friendly, millennial-focused podcasts that really define complicated news stories and unpack them, contextualize them, and really show why they're meaningful to your life. And so I think there's some real opportunities to change the way we've done things.
So which of these opportunities, is your #1 priority right now? Or is that too
No,
too much?
I think that my first priority is how do we take the news content we've got and the talk content across our stations, and how do we leverage that, take shows that are just rebroadcast and reimagine them for the podcast space. Podcasting is such a different animal.
Right.
And I know we will all have success off rebroadcasting our talk programming, but there is a much bigger opportunity to recognize the nuances of podcasting, the intimacy with the host, the ability to tell stories and re-engage the audience every 2 minutes, and take advantage of all the things that the top 10 podcasts on PodTrack every month do very well. And there are some significant commonalities between all of those. So I think that first of all, that's one big one. The second one is it requires a sea change at traditional broadcasters to start making podcasting and the access to podcasting part of your vernacular.
Right.
And that's, I still remember when we didn't have Facebook at radio stations and all those sorts of things. And that, you're that quiet voice in the wilderness that constantly has to remind all of our team why it's important. But I will say this. I'm fortunate enough to work with some incredibly talented programmers across the country who have accepted this space with open arms and without much of a heavy lift has already recognized the demand for the content that their hosts are producing. This is just the very beginning. When you can reimagine that, engage that audience that's already interested in those hosts with brand new products, it really builds you this network of trusted programs that people can access and will recommend to friends.
So since we're talking now about content and reaching those audiences, we're here also to talk about how to make money off of podcasts. Jeff, what are some existing models that exist now in the podcasting world, to monetize content?
So I would say there's 2 that might be the most dominant, but there's probably 4 or 5 or more. The first one is the most obvious one, which is it's based on the size of the audience. So it's a CPM model. In other words, for every 1,000 impressions of an ad, an advertiser will pay X amount of money. And that amount of money can really range from something as low as $5 to something as high as $100. But it depends on all kinds of things. But in terms of that model, that's a pretty common model for monetizing. So when you see display ads on your websites and when you see radio and TV and all that, it's sold on the size of the audience. And so they just measure how many people are out there, and you get paid accordingly. So that model doesn't work very well if you're a small independent podcaster and you don't have a huge audience. Once you get a big enough audience size across all of your podcasts or whatever, then that model becomes an appealing way. And it's really reflective of how successful you are as a podcast. Not how good you are, but how successful you are. The second model that seems to be, you read more and more about, that's doing very well is sort of the branded podcast model. And there's a company in Canada that's sort of leading the way called Pacific Content. And that model is basically an alternative way for a brand to try to build its relationship with an audience and extend its brand out. So it's just like they want to actually create content that's going to be appealing to an audience that they're specifically trying to target to attract them to their own brand. So they have a lot of marketing money, and they spend it in all different ways. This is a new way that they can spend their marketing money. And I can tell you that some of them are spending really, really large budgets on this type of content, millions of dollars, and they are actually reaching a lot of people as well. And when they do it well, you don't really know that it's, quote, a branded podcast. It's not an infomercial. It's not an advertorial. It's nothing like that. There are companies that do those sorts of things. Those are not particularly successful. Podcast listeners don't tend to respond to something when they think they're being hoodwinked a little bit. But if you're telling really great stories and people want to be entertained, they want great stories, they want to learn something if you do all of those things. So branded podcasts have been quite successful as a way of generating money for a podcast publisher. There's other models too. So you could do the sort of model that Chris talked about, where if you find you've made something great and you've already made that thing, or you're going to make it, and then you're finding a sponsor who might want to underwrite that whole thing for you. So that's less frequent because obviously you're not making something for that brand, but that happens too. And people can get, before they even built audience, they can get somebody to at least pay for the production of that podcast and the staff. So, and then there are other models floating around, like subscription-based models. So certain services, like streaming services like Spotify or Pandora or Audible or anywhere where you're paying them a monthly fee. I think Stitcher has premium. There's more and more of them coming out. So you'll get certain benefits. Maybe it'll be an ad-free podcast if you pay for a subscription, or they'll give you a sneak peek or a sneak preview of other content. And so they're getting money from people paying their monthly fees, and then those companies are paying publishers to use that content. And in terms of other models, there's Patreon. So there's some people who are doing things like crowdfunding, and that can be a great way to supplement and, again, build relationship with your audience. So those are some of the things that people are doing to try to generate money. I should say it's not easy to make money off podcasts, and I don't want to stand up here and say it's easy. If you think you can get a lot of listeners, everybody's going to be happy with that. So that would probably be my first thought around that, is try to figure out how you can create something that will appeal to a large group of people. On the flip side, the opportunity around podcasting is it's niche. So that's why there's 525,000 shows in the Apple Store. It's kind of like if you pick a subject, crocheting, you're going to find dozens and dozens and dozens of podcasts about crocheting. So you get a very loyal, engaged audience with podcasting, and that has value. And the type of demos that I read out to you, those are coveted demos for advertisers. So there's a lot of opportunity around podcasting here in Canada. It's younger than it is in the States, and the population is smaller, so we have more challenges here.
Yeah, about the niche broadcasting, there's a game we play on my show where you name any topic at all as obscure as possible, and then we see if it's a podcast, and there hasn't been one yet that has not been a podcast. So you can try it later. You can try it later. Yeah. Okay, so those are some of the business models. So that's how we could make money, but really it kind of comes down to audience, because the bigger your audience is, the more likely you are to be able to make some kind of profit. So what is your advice, Leslie, to someone kind of starting out who wants to make a podcast that will connect with an audience?
I think being aware of what else is out there, and again, what you bring that's unique, is the first thing. Like, what is your idea? Who are you as a host, or who your host is? What your particular tone is, and who the audience is that you're really after, and really have a sense of who that is. Because, to Jeff's point about how broad and how many podcasts are out there, I think you have to really know what you are and who you think will like your show. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at other kinds of shows that you think are kind of aligned with what you're doing, and find out who those audiences are, and maybe sort of target them as the ones that you're going to go after. So I think number one, it's sort of know who you are and be authentic, and be true to that. Do your research, know what else is out there. It's competitive, so understand what you're putting out there. Be consistent. I think one of the things that we learned, we did a survey through our SKS feed a couple of years ago, and one of the things that was really resounding there was, because we were asking, do you care what day you get this podcast dropped in your feed? And nobody cared what day, as long as it was the same day or it was consistent. And I always think about, there's so much great content out there that as a podcast listener myself, if I forget about one, even if I love it, I can forget about it really easily if it's not regularly there, and I can get distracted with something else and be spending my time listening to something else. So I think being consistent, have a plan, have a business plan for how you're going to not just create and produce what you're doing, but distribute it. Even, at our level, distribution is a really, really challenging part of the business, and finding the audiences, even with a big brand like CBC behind us, it's still a real challenge to make sure that you reach that audience that you're intending to reach. And reach out to other podcasters. I still find, and I don't know whether you find this as well, Chris, but it's a pretty collegial space still, that people are still, because people are still learning. It's unlike sort of when I was in TV, every broadcaster kept, their cards close to the chest and wouldn't, talk and share ideas. I'm still finding in podcasting, we talk to NPR, BBC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Gimlet, We talk to all of these people all the time, and there is a tremendous amount of sharing of information and experience. So I think that's the other thing, is don't be afraid to reach out, talk to other podcasters, talk to other, distributors, and just pick their brain and learn, because and one of my theories about why that's true is that you're not competing for a time slot, right? Like, you're not both going after Thursday nights at 9 o'clock. You can both have that audience. So one of the ways we built the success of SKS and other shows is identifying similar shows out there and reaching out and doing program swaps, doing if they would recommend, if at the end of their episode, hey, if you really like this show, you might also like another show that I've just clued into. It's this one, it's from the CBC. So you can sort of build those relationships where you are supporting each other and exposing your content to another show's audience, and vice versa. You have to have kind of performing shows to do that, because obviously you don't want to, it's got to be kind of an even deal. But we've had to invent, and we continue to invent, ways to get our content out in front of people. We've got a terrestrial service that we leverage as well, but honestly, I'm not convinced that there's as big an opportunity to convert radio listeners into podcast listeners. There's some conversion, but I think, and we created podcast playlists specifically to bring our radio audience into the world of podcasting and to expose them to, what's out there. But I think there are a lot of barriers to people making that transition. So you do a lot of things. And even if you're small and you're just starting out, your challenges are not that different from the challenges that we're facing, because we're all in a very, very big pool of content.
Yes.
I was just going to add, so it's true that if you're trying to reach other podcast listeners, or you're trying to build your audience, one of the most effective ways that you can do that is actually to either buy or swap or whatever, make deals with other podcasters to either appear on their shows or advertise on their shows, basically get the word out to their listeners by being a part of their podcast. That's a very effective strategy. The flip side of it is that, half of the world, or half of, Canadians don't even know what a podcast is and have never listened to it. Or how to do it. There's a lot of reasons. So when you find that everybody's cooperating because we all have the same goal, and that's to expose podcasts to as many people. There's this giant untapped group of people. Some of them will never listen, but a whole whack of them eventually we think and hope will listen. Yeah. So it's sort of, you're firing on both fronts. You're trying to,
We were part of a consortium, and you know this, Lindsay, with NPR a couple of years ago on something called Tripod that NPR came up with, where a bunch of broadcasters got together and used a hashtag tripod as a way to sort of tell people how to find a podcast and how to download a podcast. So, and it wasn't that successful, but it was an idea.
It's a good idea.
People are trying.
What is your advice to, just quickly, because we're actually running out of time quite
No way.
fast. Yeah, I know.
Sorry,
we
I
ran
feel
out of
like
running.
I talked
What's your advice to people who are just want to get out there into the podcast world?
I think that there's a few things. One, we seed a lot of good ideas. Not all of them are going to be massive hits like Serial or anything like that, but I think it's important that you do that. I think the other thing is we look for non-traditional voices, so we're not looking towards talent that are top tier necessarily. I have a young broadcaster out of CKNW who is barely on the air, who has a new show we think is going to be fantastic. So I think that seeding great ideas is important, finding great digital storytellers, spending the time to develop those shows before you release them, taking into account the fact that podcast listening is not just lean forward, it is lean back, so making sure you have a breadth of episodes ready to go before you launch, because consistency is absolutely key. I think taking account of the information we have, making fact-based decisions. When Apple opened up its analytics more than a year ago, we now understand consumption behavior in a way we didn't before. So we know how long people stick with each episode. So we can make changes on the fly, but beyond that, we can understand what kind of formatted programming we need to think about in the future. Not only does that benefit us, but it benefits advertiser confidence that people listen to the full episode, and so those ads are getting heard. So I think that all of those things play into how we do this. We have defined social strategies and what we're going to use in terms of network assets. To your point, yeah, maybe converting people from radio isn't the way to do it, but we have very powerful digital assets that will convert very well. You know, on our podcast pages, we have the instructions of, if you've never downloaded a podcast before, here's what to do. And a lot of people don't know there's a purple icon on your iPhone that you can click and grab podcasts from. But that's something we can't, ignore. We need to be changing that culture across the board. So I think it's really about being brave. I was at Podcast Movement last year, and there is nothing more inspiring as a radio broadcaster than to see 2,500 entrepreneurs who are defining the economy of podcasting as they go. And that is really incredible. And they just want to be great digital storytellers, and they are media consumers, and they're consumers of a million different things that are so niche. It's incredible, from cabinet making to finance to tech. So I think it's such a huge opportunity. It's so exciting and vibrant.
And they're all storytellers. One other thing I would just add too is the problem of downloading and that challenge. I do believe with conversational interface that is going to change. That people are going to be able to use voice activation and overcome that bumpy challenge that we have right now. I think that's something to really keep an eye on.
And Google has started to surface actual audio
That's
within
right.
search, and
It's
that's going to
getting
change
easier.
things
Yeah.
dramatically.
Yeah.
So from all the things we've just learned, it might all change tomorrow.
Yeah.
I think we have a few very short minutes for questions if anyone has one. Yes?
Yeah, so Leslie, you mentioned something about the radio wasn't reflecting what the diversity of the country was, and Chris, your point as well about non-traditional talent, which, I mean, I'm beating around the bush here, but what do you all see in terms of the audience of podcasting, in terms of diversity? What do you see reflected there, and what do you see needs to be done?
I think what needs to be done is we need to get new storytellers. We need to encourage and support new storytellers. I think it's harder because people who've been doing it for a long time tend to be at a higher level of skill and knowing how to do the technical mixes and have more experience, and so it takes more intentionality. So we are absolutely intentional about seeing what communities are we not reflecting, what perspectives are we not reflecting. Hosts that aren't, to your point, Chris, we're really, there's a project I can't talk about yet, but we're really close, where there's two really brand new storytellers who are going to be talking hopefully about parts of Canadian history that are like missing chapters that we just haven't heard. And those are people who aren't really experienced hosts. They're not seasoned journalists. They have a legitimate voice and something to say. And so we're really intentional about it, and we're trying to identify what are the gaps, what are we not reflecting when we look out at this country. We think, what are we not giving word to? And honestly, it's so exciting. Like, it just, talking to your point too, it's just about being surrounded by people who are brand new and have a story to tell and a perspective to share that we've not heard before. It's so exciting. So we're being very intentional. We're not there yet, but we are. It's a mission. That's probably our top priority, is to expand the diversity of the perspectives and the voices.
Do we have other questions?
I have one.
Yep.
You mentioned I've had former radio broadcast colleagues who, for whatever reason, they left the industry and they're starting in the podcast with limited success for a number of them. Is the consumer of podcasts, do they want that raw, non-broadcast trained voice? Those stories? Is the former broadcaster, behind the eight ball getting into podcasting?
I think if we rely on the old adages that made us great broadcasters, there are going to be significant limitations. I don't know that the voice in the presentation is as important as the story. Sticky personalities are critical. One of my favorite podcasts is an hour and a half long every week, which is long for a podcast, and it is an Irish poet who just rambles on. And it is the most intriguing podcast. I listen every week to the end. That person would never be on the radio, never be on television, but puts 500 people in a bar just to hear him speak every single week. It's incredible. So I think, to your point about varied voices and those things, I'm interested in people who have a story to tell. I can help shows be more listenable, and we can apply what we know about programming and engaging audiences to that. But I would never try and turn a podcast host into a radio personality and expect it to be successful. That said, there are radio personalities who dramatically will succeed in this space. I'll give you an example. The John Derringer Show on Q107 has historically published a podcast every day that's been a mishmash of the best of moments from that show. We challenged John to reimagine his show as a podcast. And at 9 a.m. when they come off the air, start taping the podcast. That show as a podcast sounds totally different. It's relaxed in a way that they can't be on the air. It tells stories in a way that they can't be. They can be a little more edgy. And then at the end of it, they take and curate people through the moments that really mattered on the show that day as travel guides, not just sort of, moment splitter. And it's different. So I think certain radio and television talent are naturally built towards doing this. It exercises a different part of their minds. Yeah. But all of a sudden, though, with the pitches I've received, we have a submission platform that anyone in Corus can submit a podcast through. And I get podcast submissions from people who book commercials, who write commercials, who are in marketing, and it's fantastic because you never know where that next voice is going to come from. And I think there are so many places to look. The obvious ones. Well, everyone wants to have a Mark Maron or any of those. So that it'd be great to have a top tier comedian. But celebrity doesn't guarantee success in the podcasting space, even with guests. Putting A-level guests on your show doesn't mean it's going to be any more successful. So I think the opportunity really relies on people who can tell great stories and keep you engaged for 22 to 30 minutes.
And I think that's all the time we have. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And thanks to Jeff, Leslie, and Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay.